All right, folks, we are back for the social emotional piece of the evaluation series. And so we're going to be talking about a few things. We are going to be talking about what I would do as a school psychologist or during the evaluation process. For social emotional evaluations and or behavioral evaluations, typically there's going to be a few things that are going to be evaluated. So depending on the concern or issue or information that the team needs, you're going to do a few things during a social, emotional, and or behavior assessment. First one being rating scales, second one being observations, and the third one being interviews. So if your child is going through an initial evaluation, you want to make sure there's all three. If your child is going through a reevaluation, then you might want to just update rating scales for that 3-year period. I would say if there's any improvements or regression, it's going to be an important factor, as well as good observation. In my opinion, observation is the most unbiased way to observe a student in a school setting, because you're usually recording what they do or don't do. So in any given context. So the more observations, the better. On this video, we're going to talk about the rating scales. So there's different types of behavior rating scales and social emotional rating scales. Depending on what disability categories you're looking at or what concern you have, you would more than likely do an overall broad rating scale. It can typically be the BASC. Then you're going to go into more specific things. So if you're looking at ADHD, you would see something like that's called like the Conners. And if you're looking at things like depression, anxiety, there's also rating scales geared towards those concerns as well. It's important to note that that rating scale should be given to 2 or 3 entities. The first entity being parents, second one being school staff or teachers or whoever works directly with the child, and then the third one being the child themselves if they are a little bit older. So all three of those raters are important because you want to see consistency across settings. So for instance, in my district, we have the ability to do what's called an educational diagnosis. And an educational diagnosis basically is essentially a diagnosis, but we can kind of use it for things like a Section 504 plan or to qualify kids for special education or under things like autism spectrum disorder and then other health impairment related to ADHD. And it helps us kind of differentiate what type that might be. So like I said, for those rating scales are important for those purposes because they can count how many symptoms, stuff like that. What type of rating scales and how those rating scales are used are going to be pretty important. And then you want to do specific issues. So for instance, you might have social skill concerns. So you want to make sure that there's a social skills rating scale, stuff like that. And going back to the IEP process, you also want to make sure that this rating scale formation is somewhat addressed in the IEP if there are concerns with the raters, so amongst the raters. Now, in an evaluation, the downside to rating scales is that you can get bias. So sometimes I'll get an overly positive view from the parent side and an overly negative view from the teacher side, and then vice versa. Sometimes parent rating scales. So again, that's why I said the social, emotional, and behavioral piece has usually 3 components, because again, we want to look for good, consistent data. And like I said, it's imperative that we have all of those tools, we have all of that data so we can make informed decisions.